Yeah, y'all doing? I'm back. I have here a recent conversation between Chris of a Warrior Calls and a retired Marine. You need to hear this. He speaks how the court step into our trust estate accounts to get rich. This has why we reclaim your securities written all over it, and I don't think the Marine knows the birth certificate is not evidence of the identity of the man or woman presenting it, because it is a game changer when you know that. As per reclaiming your securities in the notice of rescission, we have the power to not only stop that, but access that account for set off of debt claims, charges, and it is not limited to being involved in a court matter. I touched on this in our third video previous to this one. Birth certificate equals evidence of your interest, not your identity. Equity shall prevail. I would add to that, no government identity document is evidence of the identity of the bearer, the man or woman presenting it, unless there is a specific authority, law, rule, regulation, code, etc., that states it is. And I have never seen such an authority. Have you? And the Marine speaks of other matters, but these are of no concern to us here with respect to what we do here. And we had our first notice of rescission introductory Zoom meeting last week. It went very well. And if you're interested in more information, it's available at our blog. Right here, here's the link. It's also under every one of our videos. If you go there, do click on the must read button. Must read, click here button. It's in the middle of the screen. You can't miss it. Big button right in the middle of the screen. There's 3 of them there. Anyhow, enjoy the audio. Make sure you have your ears turned on. You want to hear it all.
Today's date is January the 3rd, 2025. My name is Christopher James, and I am truly honored and blessed to have back to the program Bobby Graves. For those of you that aren't familiar with Bobby, Bobby has been at the fight and a light for the American people for a very long time, trying to bring forth the truth surrounding the difference between legal and lawful and restoring our lawful common law courts and seeing justice and accountability reign right across the land. Bobby, welcome back to the broadcast.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Bobby. So we just started talking there a bit there and asked you a question just so people knew a little bit about you. And maybe you could just go into, because I asked you, how long have you been at this? And then you began to tell me your incredible background being a Marine. I'll let you carry forth with that, and then we'll get into this conversation today with all the great work you're doing with the Oregon Assembly.
Yeah, I started with the Marine Corps rather early. I got in trouble with the high school I was going at, and they had incorporated the Oregon system along with everybody else in the country in 1953 and changed some of the rules. And what happened was I was on a farm. I was a farm kid, and in the first few weeks of the season in the fall, September, we were always harvesting. So nobody went to school for the first 2 weeks. We were busy in the fields, every one of us, all of us kids. And I was no different. But of course, I had more than 10 days unexcused absence, and they changed the rules when they made a Secretary of Education across the country. And what that did was they made it unable to get credit for the entire year if you had more than 10 days unexcused absence, and farm work was unexcused. So what happened is at the end of the year, my junior year, I was ready to go out in the summer and start working again. I lost all my credit. It broke my heart. I couldn't understand it. I was already in the Oregon National Guard, 186 Infantry, and I was a tanker from the Woodburn Tank Company. So I had already been to Fort Lewis. I had been driving Sherman Mark IV tanks. I had learned how to shoot a tank, drive a tank, start one. And we had people from World War II still around, and they were, of course, teaching us kids and having a great deal of fun watching our reaction as we got to know what a tank was all about. And this was the tank that went across Europe under George Patton. So I couldn't go home again. I went back to the point of going to school and starting my junior high school was just more than I could take. And I ran away and tried to get into a different high school. I figured they wouldn't know. I didn't know how the system worked, of course. I was 16 years old. Well, guess what? They found my record and they told me that I had to go back and do my year again. It broke my heart. I walked right down to the recruiting office and joined the Marine Corps. Now, the reason I chose the Marine Corps simply was because of many of the farmers that I knew around Oregon were Marines, and many of them were in the World War II. So I I was working for a guy that was Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, and became an officer on the battlefield, and then got called up for Korea. And I heard an awful lot about the Corps, and I wanted to be part of it. So here I am, 3 days after I'm 17 years old, with my father's signature. I'm on my way to boot camp. Well, at the time, I didn't know what I was really getting into, and the Marine Corps is a little intense. And to tell you the least, the truth about this, I thought maybe I made a mistake in the first week because they were extremely harsh. Well, over the years, and I spent over 8 years in the Marine Corps, I came in contact with much of this idea that you don't have to obey an unlawful order, but how do you know what's unlawful? If you're a Marine, you take your orders and you do what you're told, and that's it. If you don't, you're in trouble, and it's serious trouble. So it bothered me. There's a conflict there. And eventually we came in contact with the John Birch Society because they came on bases and they actually presented us with stuff. Began to make a question in my mind as to how much of this is real, and some of it didn't seem to be quite right. Well, eventually I was involved in karate because I was in Japan, and martial art was an important thing to me in the Marine Corps. So I became involved and spent 60 years teaching karate at the University of Oregon long after I'd left the Marine Corps. My wife continued as originally one of my students and then became also an instructor at the University of Oregon. So together we have an unbroken history of a 47 straight years of karate at the University of Oregon PE department.
Oh.
Thousands of students. Well, you come in contact with lots of professors, you come in contact with lots of students that go on to become quite, I would say, successful in the real world of commercial. And some of these are now bar attorneys. So I have dinner with my former students who are now successful business operators. One is a criminal law attorney, and the other one is a corporate attorney. And I respect them. They're good men. They believe in what they're doing. But in this process, I also became what they call as an oath keeper and was actually the chapter president here for a while. I was also in the Coast Guard has an auxiliary group made up of civilians called the Coast Guard Auxiliary, and I became the commander there. So I've always kind of been busy learning and listening, and eventually I became concerned that something was off. Something was seriously off, because I've always been my hobby's been history. My family is a wagon train family from Oregon. My three greats grandfather helped write the Constitution for Oregon when it became a state. My uncle, three greats uncle, arrived in Oregon in 1846 with the Donner Party. The Donners went down and died in the Sierra Nevadas, but he came up the Applegate Trail with Jesse Applegate and his brother, riding just a horse with his wife. And eventually the family in 1847 arrived out here. And so my grandpa from the Yamhill district at the time became the first delegate of Yamhill for the territorial assembly that was convened in 1849. Oregon became attached to the United States in 1846 when we finished with Mexico and Guadalupe Delta was signed. And then we made a treaty with the UK because we both claimed Oregon and we just chose not to fight about it. And we divided Oregon in half. And the British took the northern half and we took the southern half. They changed the name to Columbia and we kept the old Spanish name of Obregon. And the rest was history. So I have the Oregon Constitution. It was written and signed and became a state in 1857. Most people think it's 1859, but that's a different process. It had to get into the Union. Now, the Union and making a state are two different things. People who live in an area make a constitution. They're the only ones that can. And they have to have 60,000 electors that are landowners over 21, male only, and unindentured. You can't be a slave. In order to be an elector, you have to have 60,000 of them, according to the many meetings of the Northwest Ordinance in the early parts of our history. So we did that. And then it took a while because mail was slow. We didn't have cell phones. There was no telegraph. We had the Pony Express working in Oregon at that time. And We eventually got it to Washington. They accepted our petition and we became a member of the Union and now are under statehood. The very first session under statehood was 1860 and complete with session laws. And I have those documents as well.
Now, if I can just jump in here for a sec, Bobby, at this time, Oregon is not an incorporated entity, correct?
That's
Still
correct. We don't have anything to record anything in corporations. We had people living in tents in Salem, Oregon. This was a frontier. So what we did was we created out of, I would say, a wilderness, a portion of the Oregon Territory, the only part that had a lot of white people living in it at the time, because Washington was almost uninhabited. Idaho was not even well known. It was way over east. And the Oregon country went from Alaska to Mexico, the whole west coast. Mexico, of course, was California. And we carved out the part that is now the Oregon that we call the state. And over a period of time, the Civil War unfolded, of course, and we were the last legitimate state to enter the Union under the original Congress that okayed our application. Because when Lincoln came in, the whole thing went south. Everything turned upside down because Lincoln literally took over the government by a military coup. He did it in a cute way. He said he was going to do these things on the campaign trail, and people in the South were very alarmed about what he was saying. He was going to rearm the Fort Sumter down in South Carolina, which was a federal facility, and it had already been closed. And South Carolina thought that was an act of war because, after all, states are independent nations, and they had the right to say no. Well, he knew that if he did that, it would set off the local militia. He did. They fired on Fort Sumter all day long, didn't kill anybody, but they made a lot of noise, and that's all he needed. Once he had an emergency clause, he could go around the Constitution and retire it and take over as a dictator.
First executive order, correct? That's the first executive order ever, I think, in the United States.
That's correct. And what happened was the people in the South, who had been already arguing with the Northerns about the slave state situation that Britain had already created here, they all began to follow Fort Sumter, and immediately everybody dropped out, and that took the quorum for voting out of Congress. Lincoln won the election. That tipped off South Carolina, so they seceded from the working federal government that everybody thinks was the center of all things and still does today, but it's not. It's not the government at all. It's just a contractor providing services for the real government, which is of, by, and for the people. That was created a long time before. Well, people don't know that because education has become incorporated, and then all corporations protect themselves, and they also protect their legal advisors, which are, of course, bar members. These bar members, like Lincoln has been said to be, we can't find his paperwork. I saw he did speak before the Illinois bar once. That's on record. But it doesn't show that he was actually a member. After the War of 1812, around 19, they reviewed the founding documents, and the Attorney General said, and the Supreme Court at that time supported it, that the Constitution organic for the United States of America unincorporated is the highest laws of the land. There's no exception. And the living people, not the persons, that's a different thing, but the people, living men at the time, over 21 as electors, are the only ones that can sit the Supreme Court, and it's called the one Supreme Court. That's always spelled in lowercase. I think the word court has a capital C. That has nothing to do with what we perceive to be the Supreme Court. That's an incorporated Supreme Court. Well, the problem that Washington was facing during these times between 1787, when they first looked at this Constitution and then hid it from everybody because they didn't want the people to know what they were looking at, they were under the Articles of Confederation. We were a confederation, but confederation does not allow for trade with foreign nations. In fact, it only dealt with one state to another state, which was a nation to a nation within the 13 original colonies. How we get along with one another. And that's where your right to travel comes from, because they decided that it's a right to travel. They took away the borders because they had locked them up for a year, and it was making a mess of everything. And Washington, of course, had taken over as commander of the so-called militia, combined militias. The funny part about that was that nobody knew how to fight because they had no military training.
The current state of what's going on right now with you with Oregon, we've really touched wonderfully on law, that this actually isn't law that's occurring in all our countries. It's policy that's written by people that are acting for corporations. And that's a word that gets thrown around a lot. Law, 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 law. Well, the law, the common law is the unwritten law, as you know, you don't trespass against your fellow man or woman, and contract makes the law. It's that simple. So let's fast forward to today if we can. You've been very, very prominent in working with these assemblies that are being pulled together. So do you want to update people on what you've been doing with the assembly? And I know we've got something now before, again, the Supreme Court, as you so eloquently spoke to, the Supreme Court, the original Supreme Court, is supposed to be the highest court of the land for common law, for them to recognize everything, except that's not what's happening today. This Supreme Court that we've got going on in the United States, Canada, these are all kangaroo courts. These are all bought and paid for, bureaucrats that are working for a service corporation, working for the Crown, the Bar Society. So we're being blocked with this law. So if I can turn it back to you, bring people up to speed, what you've been doing with the assemblies, what's before the Supreme Court now, and what you're hoping to achieve in the very near future.
You betcha. It's, of course, a big story. This is hard to get done in a small bit of time. But when I decided eventually that something had to be done, I had resigned from the Oath Keepers group. I could see that wasn't going anywhere but into trouble. And a bunch of us, former Marines, we get together a lot. I'm a member of the Marine Corps League and so forth. We decided to create an assembly, and the Oregon State Assembly was created. And we were listening as much as we could to anybody who had history that we could justify why we were saying what we were saying. I then joined also the statewide Jural Assembly, and of these two assemblies, one is only devoted to research. They are not, their psychology is not to confront because they're somewhat fearful of it. The statewide Jural Assembly, on the other side, is not afraid to confront anybody, and they've done it. So what we've done is we've gone to the playbook that the corporate world uses, which is called acquiescence. If they produce some kind of maybe a questionable policy, and they put it before the people, and the people don't even know they're supposed to respond to it, it goes without response for 30 days, and it becomes law. They acquiesce to it. It's like contracting and agreeing to a contract, but actually you don't know what the contract is. So under real contract law, it's a fraud because you have to have full disclosure in any contract or it's null and void. And that's what's been going on forever. But the people are so ignorant of this that they let themselves acquiesce to all these regulations and statutes and codes and silly things that the corporate world is doing for one reason only: steal the money. People have trusts associated with themselves that they're unaware of. They're very, very wealthy and don't know it. They can't access it. It's all been blocked. But the judges that are now operating in these fictitious courts do know all about this. The sad part is that the attorneys don't. It's not taught in law school. You see, we have mercantile law attached to and riding under the umbrella of Admiralty law, which is part of the sea law jurisdiction of ancient Rome and so forth. Mercantile law is a law of the merchant. Everything is in dollars and cents, and so it's all about the money. If you go into a court and you have a charge against you, you're given a case number. When that case number is then made, the clerk and the judge are the only ones that are in on this. You then have a bond placed against your case because you're being called into a court for what you think is a crime, and what you really have is an unpaid debt against society. That's what mercantile law is. It's all about unpaid, unsatisfied debts. They put a performance bond against your number, and then they put a payment bond against your number, and you don't know the bonds are there, and neither does your attorney or the prosecutor. They're completely clueless. It's not taught in law school. However, the judges go to a different law school, it's located in Reno, where they do learn about mercantile law and how much money can be made here. See, if you go through the court and you become incompetent, we'll say, not knowing it's even there, and you fail to redeem the bonds, then you are in dishonor. And that's a legal term. So as in dishonor, the judge then has the right to go into your trust that you don't know is there, that has unlimited money in it, and take what he wants out for himself, his retirement plan, to pay for the sheriff's department, which is now his mercenary to protect him from the public. And that's what they do. We don't have a real sheriff anywhere.
Right.
And then the money goes, what's left over, into a holding company in, I think it's near Chicago, where it then is transferred from the whole day's take of every court in the nation to the Federal Reserve of Texas, where it's printed out as a bond, a giant bond with high returns, and then sold to governments around the globe.
Yeah.
It's the most biggest Ponzi scheme you've ever seen, and it involves trillions of dollars every year.
Yeah.
We have this mess. So what we did was we used their playbook. Through acquiescence, we created a marshal service. I am the chief marshal of Oregon. I was elected by the people. My job at the time was to go talk to the sheriffs because they're the highest law enforcement officer of any county. We got to clean this up using the county sheriff. And I found that we didn't have one single sheriff anywhere in Oregon because none of them had an oath of office as required. None of them had a surety bond under their office of public trust as required. And if they have any kind of counsel, it's always a bar member who is also failing to put his FARA declaration before the Secretary of State so it can be seen by a FOIA request. FARA is Foreign Agent Registration Act. Congress knows who these people are a long time ago,
Yep.
but they don't do it. They ignore it. And when you confront them, they shut their mouths and look the other way and refuse to reply. I've been in and out of court so many times. I've gone all the way up through the Oregon court system and found it all to be in treason. And it starts with 1910 when the legislature abolished the circuit court system in Oregon. It's never been reseated. And a bunch of bar attorneys, called the Oregon Bar Organization at that time, created a C corporation with the name judiciary, in which there is a department called the circuit court. It's just a big Ponzi scheme. It's deception of the people, and they don't know any better. So you go up the ladder through the Oregon Supreme Court, another C corporation with the Dun and Bradstreet number. That's a fake Supreme Court. And you challenge the chief judge of the Oregon Supreme Court in treason, and they don't respond. But you still have the paperwork. You're making a record, and that's all we've been able to do. We can't enforce anything. We go to the district court involving Oregon. I stood before one of the attorneys in the prosecutor's office and charged him with 71 charges of treason. And he just looked out the window. I said, listen, you don't have to be in the crosshairs here, but you're in a very bad place. You're a bar member. And he said, yes. Well, then you've committed a capital crime. And that's the needle, buddy. Now, I'm not here to ask for your permission. I'm here to tell you as a member of the people, and I'm a marshal here representing the people, elected by people who elected you. Silence. He was appointed. He works for the prosecutor of the district court for Oregon. Her name was Natalie White, and his name was Scott at the time. I had a witness at the time, and I said, we know what the Chris is. And he had a tremor go through his body. I thought was cute because I'm not supposed to know about that. Chris, Court Recording Registration Act, which is a method of taking money out of the people's trust at the time of the trial, because the prosecutor and the defense counsel don't know enough to redeem the bonds. So therefore, they take that money out, and that's called the Chris. Court Record Investment.
And just so people know too, Bobby, that the bonds, the trust that we're talking about here, that's the CUSIP number that's created, correct? When we're first born in a hospital, when they create
that's the QCV trust, and what we're talking about are GSA bonds. They just represent money that has to be redeemed because you're inside of a mercantile court and you don't know that. There's nothing but civil courts. They pretend to be criminal courts and they make all kind of noise about being a criminal this and a criminal that. There's no such thing. They're civil courts. They're all about money. And in the court system, a real civilian, which would be a civil court operation, is superior to any military type court. The circuit court system in America is a military operation, came out of the Civil War. The South started out with generals in charge of areas called districts, and now it's all over the country. And then Franklin Roosevelt, of course, bankrupted the country in 1933, put in the Social Security system with some of these trusts involved to redeem the fact that he took gold out of circulation so you couldn't pay your bills. So that's a right he took away. He has to give you a redemption of some kind. And by redeeming it, they gave you an unlimited trust for basic human needs. People don't know anything about this, but the money's there if you know how to access it. The bar attorneys are there to block the access. So these GSA bonds are bought up by the district court. They end, of course, there's insurance companies underneath them and sort of writers, insurance writers. You go to jail simply because you have not redeemed the bonds. You're sitting in a box getting so much credit per hour. And the judge took the money for the cost of your crime, because everything in mercantile is a cost associated with a crime. And then you have to pay this back. Well, that can be all unraveled if you know what's really going on. And I talk to my bar attorney friends, and I can tell that they simply don't know. It's not taught in law school. Only the judge and the clerk is involved in this scheme. So you're looking at a great big RICO operation. And that's what's before the Supreme Court right now. Because I went up the ladder through Oregon. I went into the district and told the district that they had, at the time I finally finished with them, the judge there, his name was Hernandez, they got 36 hours to operate or I'm going over his head. Because I'm military, I know what the chain of command is, and we're talking military here. Went to the district, went to the appellate court, which is the circuit court 9th in San Francisco. They gave me a new case number and a new a title, writ of mandamus, but then they gave the thing, instead of to a military tribunal, they gave it to a private law firm, which said, well, the district says this, so we're not going to follow it. And so they denied everything, which made me then go to the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. I filed it there, and then they came back to me and said, well, I have to put in the...
Sorry, Rob, Bobby, your thumb's over the mic again.
Sorry, I have to hold this thing. My phone gets hot, actually.
We'll have to get you a stand. You should have a stand for it. But anyways, go on.
I know, but it seems it falls out of the stand.
Oh, geez.
So what happens was I get this bill for $140,000 filing fee for the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, that's the corporation Supreme Court. Everything in D.C. is incorporated. It was designed that way from the beginning. So if they're a service provider and they're out of control completely and run almost entirely by the Bar Association, which is an offshore organization, they're kind of a guild, like a labor union is what they really are. They don't really have any authority. They just have perceived authority. People offer them authority.
And what is that $140,000 for? Where do they pull this out of their ass?
Well, every time you put something into court, you have a filing fee. But instead of $20 or $30, it was $140,000 they wanted. Well, that happens to be against the law. So I have some legal help here. And I had a friend who really knew this stuff very well. He's almost a savant in his knowledge. And he added 4-page writ of precipice to the original charges, which is to instruct them, the whole staff at the Supreme Court, on what the law actually is. And they have no right to charge me a dime. And so we also sent that directly to Clarence Thomas. We know that he's always at odds with the rest of the justices there, and they don't like him, he don't like them, and I don't blame him. But he is a black-robed guy working in legal fiction in the corporation Supreme Court. But we wanted him to see this. And he has not responded, but it has not been denied. So where we are right now is we have placed all of our charges before the courts all the way up the ladder through the chain of command. We have an assembly now that has acquiesced the whole process into we are a provisional government on Oregon. We are the legitimate Oregon government, but we have no way to enforce it because they own all in law enforcement. They own everybody that wears a gun. They all work for the corporation and they don't know it. Not one sheriff is legitimately seated. Not one judge is legitimately seated. Everything is a fake. They're all in legal fiction and they're getting paid very well for it. So what we're looking for is military intervention. Well, lots of luck. How many military officers in the military are Bar Association members? I worked with F. Lee Bailey, for heaven's sakes, in my early days. He was a materiel officer in Mag 11, as I was involved in Japan. And I watched him operate. I liked him a lot. He was a good officer. But these are bar members, and they have a certain guild or within which there are rules that they have to abide by. But that gives the people the impression that you have to be a bar member in order to practice law. That's a lie. You do not need a license to practice law at all in America, and never have had. You can be anything you want. They cannot prosecute you unless you allow them to. But the problem is, law enforcement wears the guns. So the deputies are standing in these courtrooms facing the people in the gallery to protect the judge from their reaction.
Exactly.
Now, I went through a complete trial recently, and the guy's in prison right now because we couldn't stop it. But he was not allowed counsel. How can you imagine going to a trial in which it was pretty serious and not be allowed counsel? Because they only allow a bar member to be counsel. That's against the law. That's treason. So he stood up in the courtroom, and I was there and witnessed it. And it's on the record. He said, "You as a judge are impersonating a public official, and you are a fake. I place you under citizen's arrest today. Deputy, incarcerate this man." The judge just looked out the window and waited for him to finish talking. And they said, "Cuff him." They took him away, and he sat in a cell and watched his trial on TV. And then went to prison for 15 years. A complete fraud, a complete, I would call it nothing more than a kidnapping operation. And he's sitting in the Oregon State Pen right now. The other side of this, though, is that we know how to unravel these GSA bonds. And even though the trial's over with, the case is not over with. And we're not over with it. But we need military assistance. We need to have the Oregon Guard, the Oregon National Guard, step up as a provost marshal with MPs to take these people before a grand jury so they can explain their treason. And I told that to the U.S. District Court attorney. I said, I want 3 buses and a company of MPs from the Oregon Guard, and you are to tell them to be available to me. I'm the marshal here, and I have deputies, but we need you to do the job that you're required to do under the law. He wouldn't reply.
Yeah.
He just ignored. So we're waiting now for somebody at the upper end of government, and it has to be a civilian, so it has to be the president, commander-in-chief of the military, to allow us to have military backup so that we can do our job and clean up our mess. And the first place I'll go is directly to the sheriff's department and get them reseated. Fortunately, many deputies are listening to what's going on, and once they hear us talk and see what's going on and watch it take place in the courtroom, they're starting to cock their head and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? Well, that's the first glimmer of hope, because we can remove a sheriff that will not do his bona fides. He has to have his oath of office to the proper constitution. It has to be published and witnessed. It has to be available to the people.
Yep.
And none of them do that. And they don't even have a surety bond.
It's such a massive level of evil that has compromised the consciousness of the mind of man worldwide. And that's what I've always been speaking to, Bobby, is that all our world needs to see is for this to happen once correctly in the court, but everything is so corrupt. That's why, I was talking with generals 4 years ago in the United States, and they're saying, Chris, the only way they see forward is civil war. And I'm not about violence, but what you're seeing here that's going on here, these judges, like you say, they just they're not judges, they're actors for service corporations. They have no jurisdiction over us unless there's a verified claim that a man or woman is bringing forward into that open court that you've trespassed, meaning you've caused wrong or harm, breach of contract. It all falls underneath that. Where is it? And that never exists. They're using these codes, rules, acts. I just want to do a quick share screen with you here before we wrap it up, because I think this is important that you see this.
So, Bobby, I wanted to bring this up to you, okay? This is very recent because we're drilling down on the corruption that's going on within these repugnant court systems that are globally, not just in the United States and Canada. So here you see Paxton. This is the gentleman that's acting in a role as Attorney General for a service corporation, which is the local state. He's going after Pfizer. Again, you're going after these fictions. Now, what happened here is that he put this claim in October of 2023, okay, to go after them. In November of this past year, just actually on New Year's Eve, I believe it was, of course, they release all this stuff. What did they do? The Paxton lawsuit against Pfizer got dismissed. So this is the part that infuriates me, that people need to understand, that you've got some single man or woman that's wearing a black robe from a private society that is dismissing the most serious claims. Now, even this claim that the gentleman has put in here, Paxton, it's not really to the point. He's going after them that the COVID-19 vaccines didn't do what they say that we're doing, instead of drilling down on that COVID-19 was a lie, that all of this is a lie. Now, I don't know if he's getting into the biological weapons that were in the vaccines, but what just happened after that is that it goes to the Attorney General because it's been dismissed. He's now going to appeal it, right? This is all this nonsense that's going on right now, again, in the legal world. So I just wanted to share that with you, and reason I wanted to do that is because we have before us right now, let me just stop sharing the screen here. We have before us right now enormous work that you've been doing. You've been involved with bringing forth the truth surrounding the jurisdiction of these courts, assemblies you've been working with that we can talk about here briefly that are going on in your region. So can you walk people through, first and foremost, what Oregon is, the corporate aid side of it, and then also now we've got the on the land Oregon state, I believe, and then the lawsuits that you have that are also right now all the way up to Clarence Thomas to recognize the jurisdiction of your court so that you can start enforcing this. This is where the rubber hits the road, and we can move forward on there. So I'll turn it over to you, Bobby.
Thank you so much. Oregon, the state, is a place on planet Earth. State of Oregon is an incorporated administrative legal fiction that exists on a piece of paper. They're not the same. But the people have been misled to the point where they don't know the difference. People are living. Persons are dead. Persons only exist on a piece of paper. They're incorporated. The trick is it was done behind your back, and therefore a contract was imposed upon you, the people, when your birth certificate was certified. And in doing so, they violated contract law. Contracts require full disclosure. There was no full disclosure. The people were deceived. But the incorporated world that we seem to live in now, all under commercial law, loves the fact that the people don't respond. And through not responding, you acquiesce to it or you agree with what they're saying unknowingly. We should know all about this in grade school, but we don't, because the education system, another corporation, is holding the line on deception of the people. So what we have here is no law enforcement at all in Oregon, and it's much the same in every other state. A sheriff does not have his oath of office. It's required by Congress that he have an oath of office, but more than that, the oath of office has to be to the correct Constitution. There's 3 of them in America, and most people have no clue about this. The original organic de jure or de jure organization that the founders put together, a republic, is not incorporated. It never was. And it's the Constitution for the United States of America. And we had everything done by 1789. And the 12 original colonies, since 2 of them merged, and we started out with 13, ended up with 12, had all ratified. So this Constitution, unincorporated, is of the people, by the people, for the people. And the word people means living man, living woman, not a corporation. In order to do business in the world, what they did was they created a service provider, and nobody wanted it around. So Pennsylvania threw them out of town. They went over to New York and got thrown out of town and ended up in a swamp down on the Potomac River called the District, a place where they could conduct business in commerce because it's incorporated. You have to be incorporated to be involved in commerce. The world's sandbox of commerce is all incorporated, all operating in legal fiction. And we were not. We were a sovereign nation of people on the land, the real deal. Well, they took away the law enforcement of it. Pretty simple. If you don't have an oath of office to the proper Constitution, Congress says you can't occupy the seat at all. It's a seat of public trust. And that goes for the governor, attorney general, secretary of state, all the sheriffs, all the police, all the way down to the local dog catcher. If you're in a seat of public trust, you must have the things required by Congress, and that is a constitution to the proper, an oath of office to the proper constitution for the United States of America. And you have to have an oath of office to your state constitution, which has to be in accordance with the national constitution. It cannot be repugnant. So in Oregon, it has to be to the Oregon Constitution. And I happen to have a grandfather that helped to write it, so I'm very familiar with it. I have it in my hands, written by a feather, 3/4 of an inch thick, on leather. Well, if you don't have any law enforcement, and the perception that there is this organization called the bar that can control, I would say, the credibility of people out of law school to practice in the legal profession, that's all a deception. The Bar Association is an actors guild. It has no power whatsoever, but they've taken over the court system. And the reason they did that was because the people allowed it. See, American court is American common law courts, Title III courts. It has to be seated by living people, and it has to have a jury of your peers. We don't use judges. In fact, the justice that sits where the judge would sit in today's court only oversees the court. The jury runs the whole thing. They ask all the questions. They decide what's the best outcome. And nobody interferes with their process. There's no laws of discovery, and there's no mini sea battle going on between a prosecutor and a defense counsel just for everybody's entertainment.
Yeah.
And moreover than that,
if I can say, it's not moving under the rules of civil procedure, which is all written by the bar. People need to understand that the power, the highest authority in this world, on this land, after our creator, is we the people. There is no higher authority, and each of us have a right to move our claim and our court into a public courthouse before a jury of our peers that's seated, and they make the decision whether our claims be true or not. That's what people really need to understand. We don't need the bar. You don't need a lawyer, a liar to represent you, because that's what they do. They don't represent you. They represent you as that legal fiction. And this is the big corruption that's going on. So what you've done now, you've got this jural assembly that you've set up in Oregon. That's all, you've gone through all the processes at your end. Explain to people now what is in front of Clarence Thomas, what you've actually filed for them to address.
well, we had a case. We had to go through court and follow a case to have evidence. And somebody I know was being robbed by somebody who was armed. He knew they were armed because he had bought the weapons for them and trained them in how to shoot. And they were in the process of robbing him. And he tried to place them under citizen's arrest and wait for the police to arrive. But in the process, they bolted for the car where the guns were. He thought he was in danger, and he shot 2 people in the legs to keep them from reaching their weapons. When the police arrived, they arrested him. They said they didn't have any weapons around, but they didn't really inspect the car very well either. So he ends up in court, and so we're following it along, and he happens to be an American national. A national is somebody who's gone to the trouble of correcting their political status. They have to go to a county records office and redeclare their estate as a sovereign on the land and soil of their actual state. And he did that. That's all a record. So he went to court in an arraignment and asked to have a Title III common law court, which is very simple. It's of the people and by the people. And of course, he was denied immediately. So then he asked the judge, and I witnessed this, if the judge had an oath of office and was responsible for the people sitting in a seat of public trust, or was he faking it? And the judge looked at the floor and never replied. And then he responded, he said, you are operating a criminal enterprise pretending to be a court, and you are not a court. And the judge nodded, but he never replied. They're instructed to never reply by the bar itself. So here he is in this arraignment, and the judge realizes that he's being exposed. He drops the gavel and says, I won't hear this. Well, this place is full of other people's cases. Everyone's got their eyes open now. Their jaws are hanging open. Even the deputies that are standing in the courtroom are being shocked by this. He goes down to the next floor, which is the it's on a 3-story building, and on the second floor happens to be where the archives is. We want a transcript of this proceeding because our assembly was sitting right there in the gallery at the whole time. In fact, I stood as his counsel. It's called a next friend counsel, something never that isn't recognized at all by the present court system, but it is ours in the Constitution. And I accused the judge of suspending habeas corpus all by himself without any authority. And he said, well, are you an attorney? And I said, of course I am, but I'm not a member of the bar. And he just nodded and looked at the floor again, ignored me. So we're down on the second floor getting a transcript, and the head of the deputies came through and bumped me on the shoulder and says, we love you guys, because they've been watching this for years and there's nothing they can do about it. They're employed by the corporation to protect the judge from the people. And that's who they face. They stand there and face the people. So we go down to the next trial, which is a real trial. And of course, in a trial, in their pit, no one but a bar attorney can speak. They have their own internal rules that they've made, and they don't let you talk. And so my friend, who happened to be sitting at the defense counsel with no counsel at all, because he wouldn't allow a bar attorney, and that's all that they will allow in there. And they start down the road of all the evidence for his crime. So he asked for his counsel. He had designated me to be his counsel. I happen to be an Oregon marshal. I was created through acquiescence, land and soil of Oregon, by the Assembly of the Living People. And I'm badged up and in uniform, sitting right there in the gallery. And he pointed at me. He says, I demand my counsel to sit at my table. Denied. That's what you get from this judge. He's sitting there in black, looking out the window. He doesn't care what the proceedings are about at all. The thing is, this is a mercantile court. Everything in a court of law in Oregon, and probably all states, is a mercantile court under the umbrella of Admiralty law. What is a mercantile court? There's no real criminal court. Everything is a civil court. It's all about the money. What happens is that the law of the merchant, which came out of the Middle Ages, paralleled the Admiralty law for a long time, and then finally got joined at the hip in England. And it's all about how much money they can make off of this trial. You see, you go into there as a legal fiction. They spell your name in all capital letters, means you're incorporated, so you're not a people anymore. You have no voice in government. You go in there as a person, and you're in the commercial sector or legal fiction. That's the way they summons you. Then they put a case number against the charges. The charges are that you are being brought before the court as a debt against society expressed in dollars and cents. And there's a bond placed against your case number. It's a bid bond. Now, if you satisfy the bond through the process of the court, you're free to go. That isn't the only bond. They have a performance bond, and then they have a payment bond. And those 3 bonds are GSA bonds that later, after the court's finished, that the district court buys. This all represents money. Every crime, every offense has a dollars and cents value. The thing is, you have a great deal of money that you don't have access to. In the incorporation of the United States, and it's gone through bankruptcy several times because a corporation can be bankrupted. And in 1933, we bankrupted, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt took away gold and made it a felony to possess gold, and in doing so, took away a right of the people to pay their bills. He had to replace that with a remedy. That's the law. So he gave everybody a trust they don't know anything about. It has unlimited money on it for basic human needs, one of which is to pay any court costs that you're facing. You can also have a dwelling, a car, health care, and food. You can't just spend it like a willy-nilly drunken sailor. Oh, no, it's for basic human needs. But that can be accessed by the court if they can get you into dishonor. And the way they do that is to let you go through this trial and get convicted by a jury without anybody knowing the bonds are even there, because normal law schools, they don't even teach this process. The judge knows it, and his buddy is the clerk of the court. They know it. But the prosecutor and the defense counsel have never been trained in this field at all. So what happens is they go through this business of precedent and actually arguing with each other, putting on quite a show. And the judge is looking out the window yawning because he doesn't care anything about what's going on. He's waiting for the final hammer to come down. If the jury says guilty, those bonds have not been redeemed. You are now in dishonor. It's a banking process. And if you're in dishonor, you now are, well, you didn't redeem the bonds. He, the judge, can go into your trust and extract any amount of money he wants to satisfy the debt that's been assigned to this kind of an offense. This is what's going on. Money by the trillions going sideways that people know nothing about. Well, we find that we have this criminal activity, so we place our claims before the prosecutor of the county in which we're having this court, and she throws it out. I give her a copy of the Constitution for Oregon, and she ignores it. I go to the so-called, this is funny, go to the superior side, the Supreme Court of Oregon, and oh my goodness, what did I find? There is no circuit court in Oregon, and there hasn't been since 1910. The legislature abolished it, and they've never been reseated. There's no such thing as a Supreme Court in Oregon. All the judges are fake. It's two corporations pretending to be these things. And the people are clueless about this. So you go up the ladder and you call them out in every stage. And of course, they're always just ignoring you. And you go up the ladder like a chain of command. And I end up at the very top, which of course has to go outside the state because the whole state is corrupt. There's nobody doing their job. Nobody has an oath of office. Nobody has a surety bond behind their seat of public trust. And if you're a bar attorney providing legal counsel, the Congress says you have to declare yourself a foreign agent. It's called the FARA, Foreign Agent Registration Act. And no one has that online. And if you do a FOIA, you're supposed to be able to receive it. It ain't there. So they're all faking it. The whole thing is corruption. So I go to the district. Now, the district is supposed to be a military court. It was formed up after the Civil War in America, and a general of some kind or high-ranking officer usually seats it. We happen to have a 3-star admiral. At the time, it was Darcy Crandall. So I went to the district court for the Oregon division, and I placed my 71 charges of criminal conduct in the hands of one of their attorneys. I said, give this to the prosecutor. We want action now. I'm not asking permission. I'm ordering you as one of the people to do your job. I want military. I want some MPs. I need a company from the Oregon National Guard. I have 114 judges to take before a grand jury to explain their treason. He just looks out the window and blinks his eyes. He does not reply. I said, are you a bar attorney? Yes. I said, you're in treason. That's a capital crime. I can help you avoid that if you will, but you've got to do your job. And he says, well, what makes you think I could get anybody to listen to me anyway? I says, because you're in charge of it. If the whole state is corrupt, it's your job to correct that. You are the district court. I'll give you 2 weeks. Make your mind up. If you don't act, I'm going over your head. I know what the chain of command is. I've been military for quite a while. I gave him 3 weeks. Nothing happened. I went to the judge of the district court for Oregon. His name is Hernandez, and presented the documents there. And I gave him 36 hours. Nothing happened. So I went over his head. I went to the 9th in San Francisco, which is an appellate court. And they immediately gave me a new case number and a title, writ of mandamus, which is call to action. And I expected then a tribunal military to oversee what was going on in the whole chain of command, all this corruption, and have some satisfaction. And of course they didn't, because they turned it over to a local law firm in San Francisco who said, well, if the district court doesn't want to do it, we don't want to do it. And they threw it back in my face. That's where we went to the, I guess you'd call it Washington, D.C.'s Supreme Court. Now, I say that with a little bit of a smile, because it's not the real Supreme Court. That's the incorporated Supreme Court. They all wear black robes because they all represent that which is dead or legal fiction and not living people at all. People have no idea what the real Supreme Court is. They've never heard of it or even seen it. Just like they don't know what the Constitution is. It's the highest law of the land, and they don't know that. But the Supreme Court had already ruled on this years ago. The Constitution for the United States of America, organic, is the highest law of the land, and only the living people may enforce that law. That's their ruling after the War of 1812. And it was the Attorney General that spoke, and it was the Supreme Court that backed him up. When the people form, they are the Supreme Court. And when they rule on something, there is no appeal at all. We are the people of the government. We are the government. And people don't know that. They should know this in grade school. But of course, the corporation that runs the education systems have cut all this out, so nobody has any civil training. They don't know anything. Well, I got a letter back from a worker bee inside the office in Washington, D.C. that said that I had failed to provide the proper filing fee. They wanted about 140 grand. So we added the thing back to a 4-page document called a writ of precipice, which instructed them on the law that when it's a criminal conduct of this type, they cannot charge me a fee. And I sent it back. They didn't deny it. They just squatted on it. And a month and two went by because they wouldn't act. I got no case number, so I wasn't able to tell anybody what is going on. You got to have a case number. So we have just recently refiled, and it'll be the third time. And this time we added another document to it, pointing out that the people involved at the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. are simply not aware of what's going on. People in the middle are blocking the access. And we copied this to the people that we felt had a place where they could do something about it. The new JAG officer that replaced Darcy Crandall got a copy in the Washington Navy Yard. That's where his office is. We had to send something to various people. With the Speaker of the House, Johnson, has a copy. And of course, everybody on these documents has a copy of the people who also received these papers. We had to send one to Donald Trump-elect at Mar-a-Lago, his private thing. We sent something to Clarence Thomas of this corporate Supreme Court in his private access, along with his private secretary, and pointed out that we've already done this twice and it hasn't reached you, obviously. You might want to check out your office and see who's blocking the access. That's a crime. I haven't received any back on that yet. It's only been a week. If they just squat on it, all this is recorded and it's just evidence of wrongdoing all the way up the ladder. We are completely surrounded by criminal conduct. The courts are fictitious. The governments are fictitious. Everybody has been made into a legal fiction. Nobody knows this. The schools are not teaching it as they're required to. So, of course, it's always about ripping off the people of their money. And now they're trying to control access to health and access to education. And then you check out the law schools and find out they don't teach any American law. You don't give credit for American law in any law school. They study British law and prepare the people to pass their bar exam. And then you find out the bar is nothing more than a legal, well, what it is an actors guild. It doesn't really have any authority because there is no such thing as a required license to practice law. That's fictitious. There's no license required.
Largest criminal organization in the world.
Yeah, it's just one great criminal enterprise. And it's all about ripping everybody off and controlling the population. That's what they're doing.